Always a pleasure to talk about the great sport of snowboarding, and we are thrilled to be joined on the line today by an Olympian from 2010 in Vancouver. She competed in border cross and has also gone on to forge a very successful career in the wellness industry. Also has heard a voice on a couple of the last Olympic Games, commentating on both Channel 10 and Channel 7. And I'm so excited to learn more about her journey to the Olympics and her fascinating journey after the Olympics. Pleasure to welcome off the podium, Steph Prem. Steph, first of all, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honour to be here.
It's always exciting to talk to any Olympian on this show. Obviously, you and I were talking a little bit off air about kind of what we're doing here and everything, and we obviously worked together at Channel 7 back in February, which is insane to think that that's so long ago. But it's always an interesting journey to hear from somebody like yourself who has gone on to so much extra stuff outside of your snowboarding career, which, I mean, do you almost get a chance to talk about snowboarding still? Because you've done so many things after snowboarding. I don't know if this is something that you even get a chance to talk as much as you maybe did 10 or so years ago.
No, you're right. I don't get to talk about it as much. I think I take these opportunities because I like talking about the glory days. I think any athlete or Olympian does. It's the highlight of our career, and it's a void that's very, very hard to fill later in life. So I think it's lovely that people still find it interesting or still want to talk about the good old days. But it always warms my heart, and very, very happy to be here and chat about it.
I love sort of reading some of your past interviews where you likened snowboarding in the 90s and early 2000s almost being part of the Jamaican bobsled team, sort of where the sport was in Australia at that time. So, I mean, did you watch Cool Runnings once and then go, hey, I want to snowboard? Is that kind of what drew you into the sport? I mean, how do you get involved in snowboarding?
I'm not sure, but maybe my dad did. No, my dad took up snowboarding in the 80s when it first came to Australia. He was a mad skier, and he heard about snowboarding, and a mate of his had tried it. So he took up snowboarding and loved it. And then for my 12th birthday, I got a secondhand little Kemper baby snowboard. And the rest was kind of history. I was sort of always the son that my dad never had. So it kind of became our thing that we did together. And I skied as a kid too, but I used to crack tantrums at ski school. It wasn't really my thing. And then I found snowboarding, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And it became my passion from there on, I think, in my teens. It's probably what kept me on the straight and narrow, to be fair, through my teens.
That's always a good thing, which it's always fascinating to think when you think about snowboarding that it's really not that old of a sport. I mean, you mentioned your dad sort of discovering it in the 80s. One of the other shows that I do, this is a tangent, but it comes back to this, Steph, don't worry, is on James Bond. And there was one of the Bond movies in the 80s, A View to a Kill. James Bond famously snowboards. And at that point, snowboarding was very fresh. So it was kind of considered a groundbreaking moment that James Bond is snowboarding. So it's really a sport that's 30, 40 years old, which I don't think some people probably realize out there, given how big it is today.
I literally just had the same conversation with my dad about that James Bond movie on the weekend, because he was at a charity ball and the theme was James Bond, and they were playing all of those scenes from the old snow movies. So
Wow.
yeah, you're right. It's a very new sport. So something I was very proud to be a part of. But, it came with its challenges early on as an athlete, especially coming out of Australia and especially being female. There just wasn't a great deal of support or funding or anything available to us back in the day. But, I wouldn't take back anything now. It was sort of the best sort of 10, 15 years of my life.
Were you growing up sporty in other pursuits? Were you a typical kid playing all different types of sports? And was this with the intention that you wanted to grow up to be a professional athlete at that point?
It's funny you should ask, and I a lot of, maybe it's an Australian mentality, but a lot of people say if you don't grow up thinking you're going to be on the podium, then what kind of Olympian are you? I truthfully didn't grow up wanting to wear the green and gold. I always watched the Olympics as a kid. I was very inspired by it, but I was not a naturally gifted athlete by no means, to the to this day, my coach still jokes about the fact I have no hand-eye coordination. Like you would, if you threw a ball at me, you would not believe I was a professional athlete for 15 years of my life. It's embarrassing, but I just happen to have a lot of, I guess, I'm good from the waist down, speed and agility. I'm very short, close to the ground, and I was a ballerina and dancer for 15 years, and I think that's what sort of helped me athletically do really well in my sport. But no, not naturally an athlete, but very naturally competitive. So, you know, I was always sports captain in school, and I always loved being involved in sports, but even though I was not naturally good at many of them, but then when I found snowboarding, I think something just clicked. And it's when I was about 12 years old, and I think I took it up when I was about 11, or 12. And I think that's when it was my dad that was like, oh, I think there's something a little bit more here than we know. But yeah, I action sports are my thing. So I have a bit of white line fever, and I think it was a very good outlet for that for a long time.
So if my maths are correct, not wanting to reveal your age on the show today, Steph, but around about that age, if you're taking up snowboarding, would have been around 98 Nagano Olympics when snowboarding debuted. So was this something that when you're starting and you're kind of seeing it at the Olympics, that maybe it did light a bit of a flame for yourself to think, well, this could be a possibility?
I think subconsciously maybe, and I was, you know, very invested in a big part of the race club at our local mountain at Mount Buller, and I started competing overseas when I was about 16, so quite early on. And I started out doing PGS racing, so that was how most of us started out back in the day, and learnt, you know, edge control and learnt speed and learnt, direction and how to actually hold an edge properly and turn. So I did that for a long time, but I couldn't compete against the Europeans and the Americans overseas. But then border cross sort of transitioned its way from sort of action sports and X Games and into commercial sports, and I think that's when I found my crossover, because I was pretty good at freestyle, but not good enough to be a freestyler, and I was a very good racer. So when border cross, you know, and sort of GS combined, it was kind of, I found my event, and there was rumours that it was going to become an Olympic event. So I was lucky enough to be part of that debut.
Because it initially at Nagano it was giant slalom and half pipe were sort of the original ones, and then ultimately
Correct.
You add border cross, things like slope style, big air, all that sort of stuff gets the additions there. So I mean, even in those early days of snowboard, it was either do the half pipe or do the slalom, essentially, wasn't it? So it was kind of not much of a choice if you wanted to go to the Olympics in snowboarding.
Exactly right. And there was an assumption that you could be good at slalom and GS, which then became the PGS later on, which was more of an slightly more exciting event, but not always a direct crossover to half pipe by no means. So I think the border cross was the perfect in betweener. For those of us that just couldn't quite find our feet in one or the other.
So
certainly it was mine. Yeah.
So making your way through the ranks then, and kind of going through, national championships, heading overseas and everything along those lines, with it making its debut in Turin, was there any chance of you qualifying for those games? Was that a goal, or did you firmly set your sights on 2010 when you sort of were progressing your way up the ranks?
If I'm being completely honest, I was still finishing high school at the time, or just finishing high school. So I think my goals were very much, and that's probably a big part of my family's influence too, was getting through school and finishing. And then, going on to university like everyone does, or like you're meant to do, I guess. But I qualified based on my in 2006, wasn't it? Yeah, 2006. I actually qualified based on my some of my results in the lead up, and I had the right amount of points. So I wasn't expecting to, by no means, to go to the Olympics. I hadn't even had a World Cup start, but my points were so good that
wow.
I could almost qualify for the Olympics. So I think for me, that was when I really realized that to be fair, I probably hadn't backed my own talent up until that moment. Maybe a few other people had believed in me, as in coach-wise, family-wise, team-wise, but I probably didn't understand my potential until I got that sort of early qualification. I then did not qualify for the games, because then when I got my World Cup start, I shit the bed essentially that season. I was young and inexperienced and jumped straight on the World Cup tour the year before the Olympics in Torino, and I wasn't ready. So it was not until that sort of happened that I sort of dedicated the next 4 years of my life to qualifying for 2010, and everything changed for me from then on. It was, physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically is when everything shifted. It became my mission. It became my goal in life. I became a lot more open about talking about what I was trying to achieve. Whereas prior to that, I didn't have that mindset. So, and I really had to train physically hard to be able to make it at that level. I'm tiny for my sport. I'm tiny in general. I'm not a very big unit in life in general. So the fact that I did border cross as an event is hilarious. Like, most of the girls I competed against look like they eat about 75 Weet-Bix for breakfast. Like, I'm tiny, so I had to physically gain weight and muscle and train a lot harder than a lot of the other girls, I think. Plus, I'm coming from Australia. We're lucky if we get 2-3 months of the year on snow. So I did 11 back-to-back winters, in the lead up to Vancouver, and I had no summers, and everything became a big shift for me. I think I felt a huge deal of responsibility as well, because I hadn't made 2006. It was a huge sacrifice for my not only myself but my family, and a lot of people were sort of backing me and believing in me. So I had a lot. I thought I had a lot to achieve, in that 4 or 5 years in the lead up to Vancouver. So I had to put everything on the line.
That's crazy to think the amount of effort that would take to build up that muscle and everything. Because I spent my entire life basically, Steph, trying to go to the gym to lose weight. I've never thought about doing the opposite. So, that's crazy to think. Where do you even start? Like, do you have to speak to like a trainer, like a physio, and go like, how do I do this? How do I get my body bigger to compete with these girls on the world stage?
You can imagine the conversations, because I now work in health and fitness with women who, when I tell them I had to actually put on weight, they're like, "Sorry, I don't think you're the right trainer for me." Yeah, but look, I'm talking about like muscle mass weight. Yeah. I was very small, and like I said, I came from like a balletic background, so I naturally athletic, but not very big. So I had to put on a lot of muscle tone. So I had to change my diet, and I had to change what I was doing physically, lifting in the gym. And you have to find that right balance too, because border cross is really a mix of speed and agility and endurance. You have to be quick. You have to get the best time. You have to get down, the bumps and the jumps that are the obstacle course that make up border cross, but then you have to go around and do it all over again. And then if you get through that final, you have to go around and do it all again. So then it becomes an endurance sport as well. So you can't put on too much weight, because then you're not fit enough endurance wise to go back around and do lap after lap after lap. So it was a fine line of finding, where to be your best self and your athletic best to compete in a very young sport that was border cross. So it's a lot of trial and error.
And is it also a case of...
And a lot of balls, to be fair. At the end of the day,
imagine.
you had to have a big set of balls and a really good mindset, because the rest was all a bit trial and error, to be fair.
Which, and the mental side of things, you sort of mentioned about how it sort of kept you on the straight and narrow growing up, in your teenage years. But mentally, the disappointment of not qualifying for Turin, do you then work with sports psychologists? Did you have sort of certain ways that you would deal with the mental aspect while you were going to the gym and building up that muscle as well?
Look, it's a great question. It's not something I had access to back then. I was employing my own strength and conditioning coach. I didn't get into the Institute of Sport nor have access to a mental coach or sports psychology until after the Olympics, to be fair. Wow. So I actually never spoke to a sports psychologist until after the Olympics, which is ironic. And it was more so to deal with, leaving sport and injury later on in my career. So early on, I think that's something that I probably took for granted. I think naturally, like I said, I wasn't a natural athlete. If I was, if they were looking for athletes for this sport today, I definitely would not be chosen based on my athletic ability, but mentally I probably would. It's just, I think I learned early on. I had some very good coaches, some very, very strict German and Austrian coaches early on in my career that, taught me I had to be very, very strong in my head. Otherwise I'd never make it. In sport, and I'd never make it in a sport that Australians are naturally not gifted at. So I think I was always training my brain as much as my body, to be fair, from a very early age.
It seems like a very uniquely winter sport thing that happens for Australian athletes as well. I remember reading David Morris's autobiography, and a lot of his journey was about not being supported by the Institute of Sport, that he basically had to do a lot of it himself because the support for the men's aerials just wasn't existent for a long period of time there in Australia. And that was amazing to think what he overcame. And we even spoke with Adam Lambert recently, and he was sort of talking about how for a large portion of when he was making teams, he actually technically wasn't on the Australian team. He was on the... It's fascinating to kind of hear those journeys, which, I mean, is that improving from what you know of kind of now with success from winter sports, or is it still kind of a situation in certain winter sports you kind of are fighting this still to this day?
I think it's going to stay a fight, unfortunately, for a lot of up and coming athletes. I think we've got a lot of work to do in the grassroots sort of area of winter sports in Australia. That's for sure. That's where it's not. I don't think there's not enough support and funding. So you really have to fight your way to the top, and unless you're getting some results and you're knocking on that door pretty hard, then Australia aren't really listening or interested until a bit later on in your career. So I think it's common for most of us, but it's also, I think, what made a lot of us great athletes. The fact that I didn't qualify for 2006 is probably what gave me the kick up the arse that I needed to go and give it my all for Vancouver. And then I was told I wasn't going to qualify for Vancouver. I was the only female that qualified for the 2010 Olympics, so there was no funding allocated for a female in watercross. So it wasn't until I was sort of handed that green and gold jacket that I really believed it, to be fair, and then you'd have to shake the hands of all the people that told you wouldn't qualify. So, if anything, it just lights a fire in your ass, I think. And for me, I'm that kind of person. You tell me I can't do something and I'll go and do it. So that's probably part of my mentality. And it's probably why I worked well with a lot of those stricter coaches earlier on in my career, and, those European coaches that would push me. So, and if anything, it's probably what made me a good athlete early on in my career. But you don't know that at the time. You're just in it. You can't see the wood amongst the trees, and you're just fighting. So, but I know that now, and like you said, I've done a lot more sports psychology these days to understand it all. But back then you're just fighting, and you're relying a lot on your physical and your mental talent, really.
Which I can imagine sort of, I mean, obviously we'll get to what you're up to now sort of a little bit after, but like helps you in that side of things. But do you also kind of like using your journey and all the things that you overcame to help maybe mentor some of these younger athletes who are going to have to face similar things? Is that something that you've done, or you look at doing maybe with people coming through that progression as well?
Yeah, it's something I've done quite a bit of in lots of different sports. I mean, it doesn't just exist. Something I think that I learned going to the Olympics was that you're never alone, and it's a very common story, and it's happened to a lot of athletes in a lot of different sports. And obviously doing the work that we've done and how we met through a lot of the commentary work, it's right through summer sports, winter sports, no matter where you go, everyone's got a bit of a story. So, I'll always put my hand up to help any other young athlete that might be struggling with it. But also, my message still remains the same, is you just have to focus on the training and focus on the race itself. You're only as good as your last race, and it's anyone's game on the day, really. So at the end of the day, a big part, I think, of the work that I do now is sort of translating a lot of those skills that I learned in sport, especially mentally, is how we can use them in everyday life. And it is a big part of being able to switch off what's going on around you, and being able to still, keep your focus and keep your, eye on the prize somewhat. So yeah, I've moved away. My way of giving back in the sport these days is through the commentary. And I obviously still have a lot of friends and a lot of Australian athletes competing and a lot of not just Australians, friends around the world that are still very involved in the sport. So I love being able to tap in and out every 4 years. It gives me life, and it fills my cup up again. But my focus has very much moved into sort of that mental and physical well-being space these days. But because of that, I've had a lot of athletes circle through my business. So it's funny how it all works.
Yeah, kind of comes full circle with that.
It does. It really does.
One thing in the lead up, and obviously we'll talk what happened after the Olympics, but a few injuries in the lead up, obviously Bordercross can lead to that. A bit of a dangerous sport at times.
It's not a kind sport on the body.
No, it's not curling, or I think we established that curling's like the most safe sport at a Winter Olympics, isn't it? Everything else you generally get broken bones, but I believe you had a few dislocated ribs, a torn medial collateral ligament, and even some memory loss after a concussion. I mean, again, like everything you talked about overcoming. Your Wikipedia page is clearly up to date. I think that it comes... does it come down to the fact that pushing through all those injuries, just adding to everything you're doing, when you get that jacket, like you mentioned, like handed to you, I mean, that must add a bit of extra, gold on the green and gold, basically, that you turn around and you've made it that far to get to those Olympics.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, well said. The head injury was literally a few weeks out prior to qualifying for Vancouver, so that was a massive setback. And I didn't really, have a race to lose at that point in terms of qualifying. So the head injury was a real setback in the lead up. But again, it probably gave me a little bit of extra grunt. But I mean, I think and probably people talk about it on your show a lot, is that there's 4 years between every Olympics, but you literally find out if you've qualified or not weeks before the games. So I think in the lead up, of course, your own results. I mean, we track our own points and our results ourselves because we're nuts. So we all know where we're ranked and where we sit. But still, it still comes down to the country's discretion. It still comes down to quota spots in the lead up to the Olympics. So anything can happen. So you can have all the points in the world and have had and won every event, and most likely you'll go through. But winter sports, especially in action sports, are not that consistent. So it's a lot harder to track. So yes, the relief, I can say, in the lead up. And when I received that letter, you literally get a letter in the mail. You can ask. It's like when you get your VCE results. They ask you if you want it printed. Do you want it sent to you? Do you want to be called? How would you like to find out? So I said, all of it. Like, I'll just take everything. Thanks. I don't care how I find out. I just want to know. But I've still got that letter framed at home. So if I am having a tough day, I look back at that letter sometimes and I go, if I can achieve that at 22, 23 years of age, I can do anything. So which is it was relief.
It's look, again, as a 35-year-old, I think my time might have gone, although you never know, I could still qualify for some form of Olympics. Andrew Hoy was in his 60s, so I just need to learn how to ride a horse and I'll be set. But like it's
never say never.
Never say never. But I mean, it is one of those moments that I just can imagine is just not, you can't describe it, because I always love finding out from our guests, like, at what moment do they realize they're an Olympian? Is it the moment you get the letter, the moment you walk into the opening ceremony, when you cross the finish line, things like that? But that in itself, as again, of everything that you've been through to that point, narrowly missing out in Turin, like, I mean, I can see why you've got it framed as sort of an inspirational thing to sort of look back at. That's incredible.
Yeah, I think when you're surrounded by a lot of doubt too, a lot of doubt and fear, it's hard not to pick up on that. So in my mind, I was always going to Vancouver. I saw myself competing in Vancouver. I always knew I was going. The minute I made the decision after Torino to give that 4 years of my life, I knew I was going to Vancouver. I had some bad results. Like I said, I had the head injury. I blew my knee. I had, in the lead up, I gave people good reason to doubt the journey as well. And I'm probably more of the kind of person that when there's storm and chaos around me, I'm quite calm. I go the opposite way, but my family are the opposite of that. So when things get quite stressful, they don't really control themselves very well. So nor did I have a lot of support from the team at the time. And snowboarding was a young sport, so a lot of my friends didn't understand it. It's only now, like, I've commentated at 3 Olympics since, and this year, 2022, people were like, I never knew that was the sport you actually did. Like I just
Wow.
never
12
got
years
it.
later.
So it's like,
Wow.
it's like, oh, thanks, guys.
That's crazy.
But that's how young the sport was back then. People are really only getting the awareness, now.
Which, I mean, so many things to come from that because, I mean, I think of some of the greats of Australian Winter Olympics, Tora Bright. I mean, I know it's a different, type of snowboarding, but still snowboarding, obviously, there. Lindsay Jacobellis put the sport on the map for a bit of an odd reason back in 2006 and ultimately got a redemption this year. But, I mean, it's fascinating.
I've never wept so much.
But, yeah, which, I mean, God, to come away with 2 gold as well. Moment. Like, just to completely redeem herself. Absolutely incredible. But it's fascinating to think that it took them this long to go, oh, that's what you did. Okay, cool.
That makes sense now.
Yeah. That's, I can
it's
see why. Yeah, which is fascinating. But I mean, you got to go to a great Olympics, obviously Vancouver. I mean, great city, great Olympics in general. I mean, had you competed and been to Vancouver many times before that, or was that kind of like first time there and just experiencing all of that during your Olympics?
I feel very grateful to have gone to Vancouver. It was, like you said, a great city to be in. We had a lot of support because there's so many Australian expats obviously based in Vancouver and in Whistler, which just made for, such an exciting event. I mean, like I said, it's a very new sport, so we didn't have a great deal of support, and a lot of our events were not run at commercial ski resorts like Whistler. They're run at small, tiny resorts that need the funding, to be fair, and get the funding from FIS and from the International Ski Committee Snow Committee to put some money back into the resorts. So a lot of the time they're in very small resorts and not seeing what we saw in Vancouver and in Whistler. But I had done a lot of training out of Whistler before. I'd done a lot of training in Canada especially. So I'd actually been Canadian national champion a couple of times and based myself out of Silver Star and based myself out of Big White, for years. So it was a good little stomping ground for me for a while there. And early on, I mean, later in my career, I spent a lot of time in Europe, but early on when Bordercross was first becoming an event, we would share space with the parks. And, America and Canada were really the only place that had freestyle parks back then.
Wow. Which, I mean, I was going to mention, I'm glad you brought up the Canadian national champion because you're 5-time Australian champion, but you also, I believe, got French, German and Canadian national champions. So they let Australians in to win their national championships. You can do that?
And they don't like it. I can tell you.
I can imagine.
I can tell you. When I won the German championships, they gave the medal to the German and they gave me a case of beer. It's still one of my favourite memories.
I mean, a weird way you probably take that. Exactly.
My team was thrilled.
Yeah. I mean, you can't drink a medal. So
you can't drink a medal. That is true.
Which, I mean,
that is true.
Is that still the case? Can an Australian still go and win the German championships, or has it changed the more the sport has grown?
No, absolutely. It's like it's like a lot of the internationals now will fly to Australia or New Zealand, which never used to happen, but now to gain points in the southern winter.
Wow.
So we were doing the same. That's why we were flying north in the northern winters to get our points up. So a lot of the teams are now doing the same, especially when you're a junior. It's a great way to get your points up when you can't make a World Cup start. So you have to have a certain amount of points to get a World Cup start. So in order to do that, you need to compete at numerous amounts of events. So the best way to do that is on a NORAM circuit or on a European Cup circuit. So essentially my coach used to say, if you're not winning in America and Canada and you're not top 3 in Europe, then you shouldn't be on the World Cup anyway.
Wow.
So that was always my goal. And I got second in Austria, so I never got the European title, which still burns me to this day.
Wow.
I was so close, and I fell in the finals. And it's still
go back.
Right? I saw my coach cry that day.
Wow.
It still burns me. So the European title's the one I missed, but Jeez. Second overall in Europe. But yeah, never got to drink out of that cup, unfortunately.
Never got like a whole truck of beer. I can imagine that you get instead of just, a case of beer that you get for Germany.
Exactly
Europe,
right.
You get all the beer basically.
Exactly right.
Free
the Europeans. The Europeans know how to celebrate a win. That's for sure.
I always love one of my favorite stories on this show is when
See,
we
no
had
one's doing that for you in health and wellness these days.
no, exactly,
You
exactly.
know?
You know, there should be more of that there. But I remember Greta Small telling the story about winning an event. And she got like a case of Chupa Chups. So I think kind of we need to look at Europe for their prizes. You know, in winter sports. Like, what are we doing in Australia? What are you getting for winning the national championship in Australia, Steph? What do you get?
It's a very good question, and I think it's a medal or a cup.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
no, I need to talk to the event
You
organisers.
do.
Obviously,
You've got some.
yeah.
They owe you 5 lots of great,
I
prizes.
will get back into the sport now. You're right. I
Yeah,
should
exactly.
go back in there.
You know, I'm sure your back's fine now. It's all right. Like, you know, it's been a while. It's healed. I always love hearing about sort of the experience of an Olympics. You know, do you make the most of, say, village life? You know, going to see other events, bumping shoulders with, you know, athletes that are out there that you're never really going to get to see. Because as we always say with winter athletes, an Olympics is really your only chance for a multi-sport event. You don't get to do a Commonwealth Games or something like that where you get to experience that. So how was all that experience
So true.
outside of the competing?
Well, it's a great question because we were actually removed from the village. The Australian team was taken out of the village at the 2010 Olympics. So when I got there early, because it was my Olympic debut, I had a few good coaches and mentors that said, look, it can be very overwhelming. So better to get there early and sort of get all the excitement and the overwhelm done early on, which it is. Like turning up to the Olympic Village is like turning up to like Disneyland for athletes. It's like the vending machines are free. There's live music happening. You're seeing all these athletes that you've, admired your entire life walking around in their tracksuits. Like the gym is on heat. I can't really explain it. The food court, like that's open 24/7. So yeah, it's like Disneyland or like Vegas, if you will. It's a very strange environment and definitely not like conducive to health and well-being and about to compete in your biggest event in your life or in your career. So because it's nothing like what you've prepared for. We're used to being in these tiny little hostels and hotel rooms with the sound of your own inner thoughts, really, and then you get to the Olympics and it's like being on speed. So we were taken out of the village and they rented homes. They like rental homes in Vancouver, not far from the Olympic Village, not far from where we were competing, and then filled the house with photo frames of like pictures of Australia and our families and Australian flags, and put like Vegemite in the pantries. And they had Australian chefs to cook us like Australian food to make us feel more like we're at home. And I have to say, it made a massive difference. It was a really, really great initiative by the Australian team. It made a big difference. But I'm glad I got to experience the village for a few nights. And have you had Brittany Cox on the show?
Yeah, absolutely. We had her on a couple of times, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Britt was my roommate.
Well, so, about 15 it was back then, wasn't she? She was only a little baby.
Yeah, I thought I was small. And then Brittany Cox turns up as my roommate. I'm like, are you kidding? I'm like, this is amazing. And her and I have had a great friendship ever since. So Scotty James was also rooming next to me, and so it was, and obviously Tora and I hadn't been to an Olympics before, but she had. So it was really a lot of the OGs back then, and it was I for that camaraderie, I'm grateful, because you wouldn't have got that otherwise. And it's a very individual sport, what we all do. So we don't get a lot of time with a team, if you will. So unless we were, like I said, in the Olympic Village or walking out at the opening ceremony, that was really the only real time we all spent together. And then otherwise we were put up in the houses. So a funny experience, but one I'll never forget.
I've got to ask the question though, Steph. 2010 peak Dale Begg-Smith period in life. Did you get to rub shoulders with the man, the myth, the legend a little bit, Mr. Begg-Smith?
I did indeed, and he is a myth, but he is a legend. He is a legend. We actually ate a few meals together.
What does he eat? What does Dale Begg-Smith eat? Can you reveal today on the show?
Do you know what? I could not tell you, because I think we're all so in our own tunnel vision. But what I will tell you is he was very, very kind, because the team van forgot to pick me up one day. This is at the Olympics.
Wow.
And he gave he gave me his van because he had his own,
Oh,
and
wow. Of course he did.
he got me
Owned it, right?
he got me home one night. Yeah.
Oh,
So
there
I
you
was very, because
go.
we'll had to meet at a team house for our meals, and then we would go back and sleep at our own team houses. So that was sort of my one encounter with the man, the myth, the legend that is Dale Begg-Smith. So it was very kind of him.
I
And then
love
beyond that,
hearing that.
after he won his gold medal, no one saw him.
No,
Never
that's
to be
it.
seen or heard
Goes
from
back to his
ever
pride,
again.
but I think it was Sochi, wasn't it? Where literally, I think he basically contacted the AOC like a month before and was like, yeah, all right, I'll compete again. Like, I mean, it's just like, that's what he does. And I don't think he's been heard of since Sochi, to be honest. He texted, what's his name, after Beijing to say good job in the moguls final. But I think that was the only time anybody's heard anything about him in the last 8 years, which is incredible.
I'm quite upset I haven't had an invite to the island, to be fair.
Right, I know. We every time we get Brit on, we ask her about it. Like, Brit, come on, you got to know, right? But I mean, this is Australia's equal greatest Winter Olympian alongside Tora Bright, and yet, you know, he's off on an island somewhere, counting his millions. Why not?
Part of me admires that about him, though, because he was so just in his own world. But that's, I think, what made him a great athlete. So.
Yeah.
Part of me is like, I don't think he felt he owed anyone anything, and he definitely didn't want to bask in the glory of his win. It's not his style. So he literally got his medal and disappeared. That was it. No celebrations, never saw him at the team house again. No one could even high five him. It was odd. It's so odd.
Which it's also fascinating, though, that no matter who you ask about him, they've got nothing but positive things to say about him. I mean, what Britta said about him, just amazing, kindness and stories, and what he's also done for the sport of freestyle skiing in Australia since that gold medal and then the silver. Like, it's for such an enigma. He's done so much, but really doesn't really ask for much in return. He just does his thing, and he's like Superman, comes in, saves the day, and goes back to Krypton. That's it.
He's the introverted enigma. That's it. That's who Dale is.
It's fascinating.
You got to love that about him.
Oh, indeed. He'd probably come back for Milan. He would just be like, 20 years since I won gold. Let's give this another crack. Why not? Like in Italy as well. Like, come on.
I would love to see that.
Oh, he's still young. He's not that old. So I think he's got another one in him. So come on, Dale. You're probably listening eventually somewhere. The thing I find fascinating
about Dale, if you're out there, come on.
He's our number one with a bullet, our number one dream guest. So, just saying that, Dale. The interesting thing with border cross in Vancouver. So if I'm not mistaken, this was the last time that there was direct qualifying into the knockout. So now it's sort of seeded rounds, is it not, to go into the knockout rounds, whereas back in Vancouver you actually were qualifying for the knockout rounds. Is that correct?
No, we still qualify, so there's definitely still a qualifying round, but what has changed is that so Vancouver, I think, was the last time there was 4 competitors on the course at a time. Then it went to 6, and now it's gone back to 4. Because it's too dangerous. So that has shifted. But they've just changed the qualifying. You still have to qualify, so the girls still have to qualify in the top 16, and the men still have to qualify in the top 32. But they have changed the second round of seeding. Whereas you used to have to do 2 qualifying runs and you take the best of the 2. Right. Whereas now you need to get a sort of safety run in.
Which is kind of like, so we saw that in Beijing, didn't we? What was like the top, for the men, like top 16 in the first round, and then you've got to run again to go through. So
correct.
I mean, the reason I bring that up.
And then they run it in reverse order. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I bring that up because obviously for you in Vancouver, it unfortunately didn't quite go to plan on that second run to get you through. I mean, going back to everything you're saying about how you got there, do you go in with a goal? Like was the goal, I'm at the Olympics now, everything's a bonus? Or do you still go in with I can medal, I can get into a certain round, and obviously didn't quite go to plan, I can imagine, if you did set yourself a goal?
Yeah, I think there's always a goal. I think at that point you can't get to that pinnacle of sport and not have a goal in mind. But for me, and again, I think people get upset when I say this, it was never to podium, but I wasn't against a podium, if you know what I mean. So my best result coming into the games, like my best qualifying result was 12th in the world. So for me, I'd been trying to crack the top 10 in the world for quite a few years. So in the couple of years in the lead up to the games, for me, a top 10 in the world was my best result. So like I said, I'd podiumed at all the national level events, and had seeded well, and sort of took me a really long time to break the top 20 in the world. And then once you break the top 20, it's, top 15, and then it's about breaking that top 10. And so that sort of last part of my career was between that top 10 and top 15 in the world was where I sort of sat and where I really struggled. So I tried everything, like I said, from changing my weight to changing my equipment to changing the way I train to break it. And 11th and 12th were my best results in the lead up. So for me, going into the games, it was a top 10 result. That's what I wanted. I wanted a top 10 in the world at the Olympics. And border cross is kind of like a Stephen Bradbury type situation. Once you're in that top 10, 15 in the world, anything can fucking happen.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
You sort of know you're in the mix and you know where you stand. And a lot of these girls that were in the top 10, that I could beat them in training, but I didn't have the race experience that a lot of these top seeded girls did have. And I think that's where I sort of struggled. And that's why I really would have loved to have got one more games in my belt. I just think if I had been able to go around one more time, I was probably a couple of years off being in that top 5, 10 in the world. Realistically, based on experience, based on everything I'd done in the lead up, like you said, to that point, with a couple of setbacks along the way. But that's not creating excuses. That's just where I sat in my career. And, Mael Ricker that won the Olympics that year, she was in her early 30s. I was 23, 24 going into the game. So I was actually still quite young in our sport. For me, it was all about that top 10 result. And then once I could get in that top 10, for me, I'm my worst enemy. So, which is, I guess what we're about to speak about is the qualifying rounds is what used to bite me in the ass. I'm great in heats. I'm good under pressure. I'm strong in my head. And like I said, when I can be really, really good when I'm told I can't do something. So if one of the girls would get up at me in the gate, or someone would be a bit feisty in the start section, like it's fucking on for me. That's when I was really good, and that's when I got my best results, and that's how I did well in all of those other qualifiers, was because on race day I knew it was anyone's game, and I knew that if I could just get out in front in a heat, then I was a strong enough rider to hold my place. But it's the qualifying rounds that's where, you'd have that internal voice in your head there. If you didn't stay on your feet, that's where you could really fuck it all up. So, and unfortunately that's what undid me at Vancouver. So in the first round of the games, again, I'm just painting a picture, by no means making excuses, but for those who didn't follow Vancouver as closely as the rest of us, it had not snowed for 3 months in Vancouver, in Canada, which is unheard of. And they were bringing snow in choppers. They were choppering in the snow from Whistler to the local mountain that we were competing at in Vancouver and sticking it on skate ramps.
Wow.
And so they were combining man-made snow with natural snow and sticking it on ramps, wooden ramps, to create and build an obstacle course out of snow. But you can imagine you've been training for 4 years on natural snow and competing on natural snow. So to compete on something like that feels completely different under your feet. So your equipment feels different. Your wax is not the same. Your speed is completely off. Most of the boys in training had hurt themselves or were making complaints about about coming up short on a lot of the features, meaning they were coming off jumps and not making the landings. And the boys are carrying a lot more weight and speed than we are, and the girls are competing on the exact same course. So needless to say, it was a lot of challenges in the lead up, and normally we would get 2 days, especially in an Olympic or World Cup event. You would always get 2 days of training on a course, because they're treacherous, they're a lot bigger, they're twice the size of a lot of the other courses, so they need to give you at least a day or 2 of training on the course before they let you compete on it. And obviously weather and everything else comes into play as well, and can affect your performance on the day. So, and they cancelled the day of training before the day before the Olympics, because they wanted it to look good on TV for the games. And because all the riders were taking the snow away, it looked terrible. So, they cancelled our day of training the day before the Olympics. So, it sent a lot of us into a real tailspin. So I had to have a very, like I said, I had no sports psychologist back then, but I had Danny Roach, the Australian Olympic hockey player, was a huge mentor of mine and had worked with me in the lead up to the games. We'd met through mutual friends, and she'd become, an absolute mentor to me in the lead up and helped me prepare. And I never forget the phone call she made to me like the day before the Olympics going, "Gee, mate, doesn't look like there's much snow over there." And I was like, "Great observation, Danny."
Yep.
And I was not in my best headspace. And she really, I think she talked me off a ledge, and she was like, "Okay." So she's like, "All right, so you're competing at the Olympics in 48 hours time." And she's like, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I can't do anything because we can't compete. And they've cancelled the training, and we're not even allowed to look at the course. We're, I started reeling, and she just, like I said, just talked me out of it. And she said, "Okay, so how many of you are unable to train on the course?" I was like, "Well, all of us." And she was like, "Okay, so all of you, none of you can train." I said, "No." And she said, "How many of you are allowed to go look at the course?" I said, None of us can go see the course. None of us. Okay, great." And she said, "How many times have you run the course in your head mentally then, since being told that you're not allowed to go look at it, go train on it today?" And I was like, "Ugh." And she was like, "Cool. So everyone's in the same position. Not everyone is exactly where you are right now. So your only advantage is mental and physical. So have you been to the gym today? Have you flushed out your legs? And how many times have you run the course in your head?" Because she's like, "I need you to run it at least 150 times between now and tomorrow." Because she's like, "You and I both know that you can do the work in your head between now and then." And it was just the reframe that I needed, because we were completely freaked out by the fact that some of us, because the first day of training, it was running so slowly, most of us had not run the full course. So we were turning up to the Olympics, the biggest event of our lives, and most of us had not even run a full course.
It's insane. That's absolutely
so anyway.
insane.
I digress, but yeah, it was it was pretty frightening. So like you said, you kind of, your goals don't go out the window, but you turn up in a slightly different headspace than you expect. And a lot of injuries happened on the day. I saw that, three of my absolute heroes in the sport get taken off in stretchers, because you've got those big screens at the top of the course where you're seeing everything. And so, needless to say, I was a bit shaken in my head. So I put in a safety run, and I was sitting in 11th place after my first qualifying run. And I was like, "Fuck, I'm so close to that top 10. I can almost taste it." But it was safety run. Like, it was so safe. I was so shaky under my feet. And I got to the top, and my coach just shook his head and was like, "It's not good enough. And you're going to have to pull something out next time. Otherwise you're not going through today. It's just not going to happen." So I was like, "Fuck, okay." And obviously we have to qualify top 16 places to go through to finals. So I was in 11th, pulled out for that second run. And it was running, because obviously the boys had then run it and now the girls were running it. It was running a little bit faster in the afternoon, thankfully. So I could finally feel, a little bit more flow, a little bit more rhythm that I wasn't finding earlier in the day. And I got about halfway down the course and I thought, "Fuck, it's now or never. I've got to let it go." So I started to, take the brakes off a little bit and start to hammer a little bit more. And I thought, "No, I feel good. I feel okay." And I was definitely coming around a lot of the turns and the jumps a lot easier. And then there was just a technical feature, about 3 features from the finish line, where you sort of had to choose whether you wanted to triple a feature or go over it 1, 2, 3, if that makes sense. The best way to explain that verbally. But you either pump the 3 features or you can just triple them and go over them. Anyway, I decided to go for the triple, even though I hadn't in training, because I thought I had a lot more speed. And I just came up a little bit short. So then the last 3 features before the finish line, you can imagine I didn't quite have the speed because I'd come up short on that feature. And then next thing I knew, I was in the air and I was ragdolling and scarecrowing, whatever you will call it, and put in quite a spectacular crash. And it actually went on to be the number 9 highlight in the Olympic and Eurosports highlights of top 10 crashes of the Olympics. You made
the top 10 then, Steph. Well done.
I made the top 10.
You did it. You made the top 10 at the Olympics. So come on, take that on board.
Should have been a little more specific with my order when I put that one in. My top 10 result, to be fair. And they replayed it in slow motion, excuse me, that many times. It was horrendous.
Which, I mean, with all of that, I can't even imagine how you're feeling at that point, because for starters, with all that you've gone through, you've gotten to the Olympics, you've gotten that close, and then that happens. So obviously is that disappointment. But on the flip side of that, I can imagine that once the Olympics are over, it's mentally, well, 4 years till the next one. And obviously we can talk about what happened, not that long afterwards, which prevented you from going to another Olympics. But how does that take a quick turnaround to sort of recover from that disappointment and focus in towards Sochi and what your next goal would have been at that point?
Yeah, it was a very surreal time, I think. And I, to be fair, I think years later, I did the work mentally that was required, excuse me, to recover from the disappointment that was that result. But I sort of I picked myself up. I had a few broken ribs, got to the finish line. And like I said, you still need to make the top 16. So I got down and I was still sitting in 14th place, even with my crash. And then I just watched myself go 15th, 16th, 17th. And I think it was like point. It was so close. Like it was so close. I missed out by like that much. And I think that's what hurt me, was just that it wouldn't have taken much. And maybe, you replay that run in your head so many times of, maybe I shouldn't have taken the gas off so soon, or maybe I should have done this, or, if I had have taken a higher line here and there. So you play that game with yourself for a really long time, and it's a very dangerous space to sit in. So I think I sort of switched it off because the Olympics sit in the middle of the season. So I still had the season to finish out. And for me, I still wanted that top 10 result, and we had World Cup finals coming up. So I sort of thought, you're only as good as your last race, and I'm just going to put it out of my head. I took a couple of weeks off because I had a couple of broken ribs. And then, we had World Cup finals, and my coach had said to me that I was probably a bit burnt out. I probably shouldn't go to World Cup finals. I was pretty beat. 4 years in the lead up to the games to not get the result you want, like mentally, physically, you're not in your best place. But I was still pretty driven. And I think, a big lesson for all of us, and I speak a lot about this, and when I do a lot of speaking events or motivational speaking events, I think when we set out to do things not for ourselves or to prove something to others, we're never going to get the best result, right? And I think at that point I stopped competing for myself. I was out to prove that I could get that top 10 result, and it became about showing everyone that it was so disappointed in me from my Olympic result, and the Australian team and everyone else, that I could still compete and I could do what I was capable of doing. But I lost the spark and I lost the enjoyment. I wasn't doing it for me anymore. I was out to prove something. So I still think that's what led to the events that then became of me at the World Cup finals, which I can laugh about now, but they're not funny.
Yeah, well, I mean, what happened a couple of months later, the accident, the injuries essentially ended your athletic career at that point, didn't it? I mean, the crash that you had, reading here, compressed the L4 and L5 vertebrae in your spine. You had nerve damage, broke 5 ribs, subluxed your hip, did damage to your pelvis, tore your hamstring, had a hematoma, several spinal... it literally sounds like you were like just broken everywhere. It just sounds absolutely horrific, which, how do you get to a point after that you've worked so hard for so long to get to a point where you are competing at the highest level, and it's taken away from you in an instant? How can you possibly recover from that and do what you're doing now and kind of, as you said, almost basically laugh about it now 12 years later?
Yeah, look, I probably shouldn't laugh about it. That probably comes from a place of having to deal with a really bad injury for a long time. I think, and there was a lot of PTSD involved. I think coming off a 60-foot jump short, like meters and meters short of where you should land, and essentially, like you said, breaking the left side of my body. Sort of, my physiotherapist explains it, or describes it, I should say, as like the equivalent of falling out of a first floor building to concrete.
Wow.
Or that of like the impact of a really bad car accident. So yeah, like you said, I think the fractured and compressed vertebrae in the lower part of my spine is which is what created a lot of damage, and it's sort of, I guess, the work I've had to do, not just physically, but I think mentally, to come back from that injury, and the pain management. What I had to learn about pain management at a very young age was was pretty frightening, and I still deal with a lot of the whiplash from the injury to this day. So I suffer from a lot of nerve pain, and I still have you know, pretty severe whiplash, which I think comes from that concussion and comes from that head injury and the whiplash of the accident at the time. So yeah, it was, you know, it was horrific at the time, and obviously excruciating. But you know, a big part of, I think, the comeback for me was thinking I could go back and compete again, which is crazy, which says a lot about my own mental mindset. But it's what helped me get out of bed every day. It's what helped me do the rehab, because I really thought I was going to make it back for Sochi. I'd never had such a bad injury before. You know, like you said, I'd had knee injuries, I'd had ankle injuries, I'd had head injuries, I had done my fair share of injuries, but most of them you're given a timeline. Most of them, they're like, okay, if you do 6 to 8 weeks of therapy here, and then you do this and this, you'll be back. Or if you spend a couple of months treating this or strengthening that, you'll be back. Whereas with this, it was just, there was so much damage, you know, literally from my left ankle through to my head, my whole entire left-hand side of my body. Essentially, I still have so much muscle imbalance to this day that I have to manage and deal with, that it took years. Like, it was just, it was years of work that I never expected. So to think that I could come back for Sochi is laughable. That's why you can laugh. But also, it's probably that driven mindset that helped me, and denial that helped me get through, you know, a big part of that time. And a big part, I think, of that, like, physical and mental recovery for me was doing some of that coaching work, doing some of that mentoring work, doing some of that speaking work. I went and studied clinical exercise and Pilates, because I was doing so much of it anyway. It just became my life. Never did I think that would become my job or my life later on. I literally just did it because I thought I was going back on tour and I would compete again, and it would just be helpful to understand, you know, my own body and, you know, biomechanics and anatomy and all of that. I thought that would just make me a better athlete. Wow. I was never doing it thinking I would end up spending the next 10 years of my life putting other people's bodies back together. So,
crazy,
you know, the irony.
That's how it turned out. Yeah, the irony.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It is ironic. So it's you know, the injury, the rehabilitation, the sports psychology, everything that went into those years of recovery. You know, and I learned very early on about anxiety, about depression. I wouldn't say I was depressed. I definitely suffered from severe anxiety, but it was very much related to the physical pain that I was dealing with, you know. And there is a lot of, obviously a lot of science now and research behind the links between physical pain and mental pain. And you know, real pain and ghost pain and everything that I dealt with for years because of the nerve damage. You know, and just multiple MRIs and scans for years, because just could not work out why I was getting such horrific pain still years after the accident. So wow. It's, you know, honestly a massive challenge, and it's probably what led to, well, I know it's what led to, because in the end, Western medicine wasn't helping me. I was just getting pumped full of drugs and pumped full of painkillers and sleeping tablets to get me through years of my life. And I think I just woke up one day and went, I cannot go on like this. So it really led to, I guess, looking more holistically at my health. And it was really Chinese medicine that got me out of it all and got me off all the drugs and cleared my system and got my health back and got me into a better headspace. And I tried everything, like anything you can mention, I tried to get myself back. And I think that's what led to the development of Studio PP, my business. And it's what led to, a very much more holistic approach to health and wellbeing than what I had back then as an athlete.
Which is, I can imagine it's that, you know, passing it on sort of situation there, that you've gone through all that adversity, but you've discovered this great new lifestyle that's helped you, and then passing that on to helping others. It's kind of back to what we're talking about, you know, mentoring people, not necessarily always athletes, but just people in general, which, I mean, it seems like it's obviously going fantastically for you now, but also very rewarding. And for your own mental health and mental well-being, I'm sure that's helping you at the same time.
Very much. And I think there's years of my life there that I don't want to say lost, but where I felt I couldn't give back to the sport, or I couldn't even, you know, probably give back to myself, to be fair. It took a long time to come out of it. And I'm very open about that now, and I think that's what's attracted a lot of athletes, but beyond that, and or business leaders, and anyone really, to my business that may be struggling with their health, or like I said, pain management, or injury rehabilitation, because there's so many ways and so many angles to come at it. And also you have to learn to work with the individual. And for me, it took a really long time. And we mentioned it earlier, I was used to very strict coaching. I was used to a very hard on all or nothing approach to sport. And my rehab and my recovery required the exact opposite of that.
Wow.
I had to learn. Yeah, I had to learn to rest. I had to learn to recover. I had to learn to switch off, and it's something I still struggle with to this very day. I can almost hear my boyfriend laughing at me in the background. Like I just.
What are you talking about? This isn't you.
I am such an all or nothing personality. So to learn to live in that in between space, and I think that is the essence of well-being, and that is the essence of health. Is that the balance, right? That we're all seeking and that we're all looking for, because we can't all operate, and sure, when you're trying to qualify for the Olympics, you operate at 110% because you're giving your fucking everything. But like taking that approach when I didn't have an Olympics to qualify for was only hurting me. It was setting me back in my rehab. It was setting me back in my injury. It was setting me back mentally, physically. So really, really, really big learning curve for me. And I'm a much better person and a healthier person today than I was 10 years ago.
It's always fascinating, those sliding doors moments that one thing can happen and set you on an entire different path. People who are listening to this and are intrigued, Steph, about what you do and sort of are interested in this, where can people sort of find information out, sort of get involved with what you're doing out there, direct people to it? Plug it.
Plug it. I mean, I think the best way to describe what I do these days is sort of, translating high performance into everyday life. Like I said, bringing those sort of transferable skills that I learned in sport into everyday life and sharing them. I'm obsessed with high performance. So like I said, I'm obsessed with getting the best out of not just myself, but of anyone. And I think it's not because I come from high performance sports or from a background, but I think I'm very passionate about helping others drive, effort, better output, productivity, well-being, like I said, balance, health, whatever word resonates with you. So Studio PP, which is my business, which aptly stands for premium performance, being the most premium version of yourself, performing at your best, is all about that, living a happier, healthier, more fulfilling life, if you will. So we do that physically, we do that mentally, and I spend most of my time these days doing a lot of speaking and corporate health work. So You can find me on my website, which is stephprem.com.au, and you can also find me through Studio PP. But I think as much as I hate to admit it, the best place to find anyone these days is Instagram.
Yep.
So the gram. at Steffi Prem, and you'll find the links to everything else I do there.
Perfect. Two quick things before I let you go, Steph. First of all, I've got to just quickly touch on the commentary. Obviously, as I said, 3 Olympics, Channel 10 back in 2014, last 2 with Channel 7, getting to work alongside the legend that is Dave Colbert. I mean, that must be a fun experience, getting to sit alongside him and then bring all that expertise to the table to millions of people watching around Australia.
Look, like I said, it's absolutely fills my cup every 4 years. So when I get that phone call from the network to say we want to have you back, it's always an emotional and exciting moment. Dave Colbert is an absolute jet. I love working alongside him. He's taught me so much. But I'm very grateful for Leslie Tapsell, who's actually been the producer on those 3 games across both those networks, and who has kept me involved in the sport and kept me involved on that commentary side of the team. And I love being able to give a voice back to the athletes and a true insight to the sport. And the main reason I do it is because my event was commentated by an AFL football player back in the day when I competed.
Who was it? Who did that? Was it Channel 9 had that back in the day, didn't they?
Without mentioning any names, let's just say it wasn't a great reflection of the sport.
I've got the footage on my computer. I'm going to look this up afterwards. I need to remember who did it. So okay, I'm intrigued now.
So I made a promise to myself that I would get on that commentary team one day, and I would call that event what it what it should sound like and what it should feel like under your feet as an athlete, and to be able to give that insight. And I'm grateful to work alongside Colbert, who lets me give that true insight. And he's like I said, an absolute jet at being a race caller.
Yeah, and watching the extent of research he puts together is absolutely insane. And before I let you go, Steph, you and I were talking a bit about this off air, but you're joining my world, podcasting. This is something that you're getting involved in. Give it a plug. How did this come about, and how addicting is it? It's more addicting than snowboarding, isn't it? Come on.
Yeah, I think we touched on it earlier. We both love a chat. So I'm, like I said earlier, I'm pretty obsessed with high performance and how people tick and work and get the best out of themselves. So it's a combination of that and well-being, and really exploring, I guess, mindset and mindfulness and how that plays out for some pretty interesting people and characters. Something I've always wanted to do. So post-pandemic, I made a promise to myself that I'd do, and especially after doing 7 this year, after doing the commentary, I just thought it's really a creative project and outlet that I want to put some time and energy into. And it's sort of an extension of the work that I've done with Medibank the last few years as their health ambassador. They're now supporting my podcast to put a new health and wellbeing podcast out in the world. So that will be coming out in the next few months.
Are you allowed to tell us what it's called yet, or are we just got to keep watching this space?
I can't tell you. Watch this space.
Secrets. All right. Okay.
Yes.
Well,
follow you already know too much.
Yeah, I know, right? This is, they're gonna hunt me down after this, but obviously follow your social media, and when it's all out, people.
Correct. It'll all be live well soon, and a couple of those characters we've spoken about today you might hear on the podcast soon. So
if you get Dale Begg Smith, you send him my way, okay? You can't have him all to yourself, all right?
when I get to that island, you're coming with me.
Thank you. Yes, I definitely would appreciate that, Steph. It has been an absolute pleasure to be able to do this. Seriously, your story is so inspirational. It's heartbreaking. It's everything. You need to write a book. I really think you need to write a book on everything that you've sort of done in your life and everything since. It really is a great story. But I really appreciate your time on the show today, and look forward to you kicking our ass in the podcast landscaping in only a couple of months' time.
Don't be ridiculous. It's been an absolute pleasure, an absolute honour. Thank you for having me. It's always great to take a trip down memory lane.